Hey, so there's a fella named Thomas Paine, right? And I've learned about him recently, mainly from this book by Christopher Hitchens, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. And here are just a few of the things that I've shown you here about who he was in case you had no idea, which I suppose I'm probably in the minority of people who don't know. Oh, hello. Let's see. So, let's see. His book opens like this. It's a brief. Not a very big book, but there's quite a lot in here, and I don't know. I've always grown up with a sense that the people who always talked about the founding fathers and what sort of vision they had, were like old curmudgeons that didn't really understand things and were disconnected from where society is today, and that modern politics had moved on substantially from where they were at the time. And reading something like this makes me realize that that's not true at all. In fact, things have probably not moved on very much at all. We're discussing virtually the same topics today in politics that we were then. So I'm just going to start reading this. I think it's a really good book, and I would suggest that other people, if you're interested, just read it yourself. It can often be more influential to read something yourself because it's better in your own voice, in your own head, right? Let me see. Introduction. Children in the United States are taught early in life to sing "My Country, 'Tis of Thee," in which the main verse goes, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." I remember singing this in school. We didn't just sing like the one verse. We sang it all, and we had like a Lutheran version of it. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side, let freedom ring. And of course we like turned it into different, like I said, different dumb versions of Lutheran dogma or whatever. It's so commonly adopted by other people for their own message. This is an averagely sentimental ditty, but it was promoted to immortality by the great Dr. Martin Luther King in the imperishable speech that he made on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial at the climax of the Civil Rights March on Washington in the spring of 1963. Seizing the familiar words of the schoolroom for his peroration, he demanded that freedom should ring from every hilltop, north and south, from New Hampshire to California and down to Mississippi, until the original promise of the United States had been kept for all its citizens. "If America is to be a great nation," he proclaimed, "this must become true. My country, 'tis of thee" would be a fairly easy song for British school children to master as well. It is sung, for one thing, to the tune of the national anthem. Well, I didn't actually know that. Well, I did, because I've read this book before. But anyway, moving on. This rather unimaginative hymn, the first national anthem in the world, as it happens, seems to have originated as a Jacobite chanson, but was rewritten for the cause of Protestant Church and King in September 1745 as the Jacobite rebel invaders from Scotland were menacing the throne. A theater audience in London rose to intone, as well as the first verse, the less commonly heard second one. "O Lord our God, arise, scatter his enemies, and make them fall. Confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks. On him our hopes are fixed. Oh, save us all." The hymn, in this case, was George II, representative of the Hanoverian usurpation that endures on the British throne to the present day. By the early 1800s, his son George III was being greeted by this song on official occasions. And by that time, another version was in circulation, written by the great radical artisan poet Joseph Mather. I don't think I can sing this one. It's 4 verses here, so if you see, I'm going to be really pressed. God save great Thomas Paine, his rights of man explain to every soul. He makes the blind to see what dupes and slaves they be, and points out liberty from pole to pole. Thousands cry church and king, that well deserve to swing, all must allow. Birmingham blush for shame, Manchester do the same, infamous is your name, patriots vow. Pull proud oppressors down, knock off each tyrant's crown, and break his sword. Down aristocracy, set up democracy, and from hypocrisy save us, good Lord. Why should despotic pride usurp on every side? Let us be free. Grant freedom's arms success, and all her efforts bless. Plant through the universe liberty's tree. This is a very common imagery that was used in that time and is still used to this day. Facts are seditious things when they touch courts and kings. Armies are raised. Barracks and bastilles built, innocents charged with guilt, blood most unjustly spilt, God stands amazed. Despots may howl and yell, though they're in league with hell, they'll not reign long. Satan may lead the van, and do the worst he can. Paine and his rights of man shall be my song. This fine parody, composed in 1791, is taught in no school and sung in no assembly, but it captures, with its defiant and satirical pugnacity, the spirit that was aroused that year by the publication of Thomas Paine's classic. Joseph Mather was a radical file maker. I'm not sure what a file maker is. In the city of Sheffield, one wonders whether he inspired or whether he drew from the song that was struck up at an evening of the more mainstream Society for Constitutional Information, which, at its London meeting in March 1791, voted its thanks to Paine, and then heard members of the successful majority intone, God save the rights of man, let despots, if they can, them overthrow. It seems likely that Mather was writing later in the year, since it is easy enough to interpret his apparently odd phrase, Birmingham blush for shame. It was in Birmingham in the autumn of 1791 that a Tory-inspired mob, frenzied by the cry of Church and King, broke into Joseph Priestley's house, destroyed the library and laboratory of the self-taught scientist who had discovered oxygen. This incident, another of those historical episodes that is not taught in schools, decided Priestley on a move to America, whose revolutionary and republican cause he had already espoused in a pamphlet. He was there to become a welcome guest and a participant in the great Philadelphia Renaissance that featured such men as Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and Thomas Jefferson. One should not allow oneself to forget that the English friends of the Revolution in America and the French in America and France were not always greeted only with the high moral tones of Edmund Burke, who approved of the Church and King mobocracy when the mob was on his side, but also with persecution and repression of quite a high and systematic degree. Other contemporary clues can be found in Mather's lines. He used the word patriot to describe the supporters of the democratic and radical cause. This had also been the term employed by John Wilkes' faction in Parliament and its supporters outside it, the famous partisans of Wilkes and liberty against a German crown and a Tory-dominated system of rotten boroughs. It was only that version of patriotism, incidentally, that the Tory Dr. Samuel Johnson described in a remark that has been misunderstood and misquoted ever since as the last refuge of the scoundrel. The word Bastille was also fresh in the mind in 1791 as the symbol of the French absolutist monarchy and as a synonym for the many dark prisons in which the liberals of Europe had so long been confined and tortured. The Marquis de Lafayette, chivalric hero of both the American and French revolutions, gave the key of the Bastille to Thomas Paine and requested him to forward it to President George Washington as a token of French regard to the American people. Paine had done so with delight in the year before he published Rights of Man, adding a cover letter which described the key as this early trophy of the spoils of despotism and the first ripe fruits of American principles transplanted into Europe. Again, notice transplanted, tree. All of these things are imagery and symbols that are still used today. The key hangs to this day on the wall of Washington's home at Mount Vernon. The date of Paine's letter was the 1st of May, which a century or so later was the date selected by American workers as the one on which to begin the struggle for the 8-hour day, and afterwards by the labor movements of all countries as May Day, the holiday and carnival and fiesta of the oppressed. Spring and the natural world were ordinary metaphors for Paine, as they have always been for those who witness the melting of political glaciers and the unfreezing of the tundra of despotism. I have not the least doubt of the final and complete success of the French Revolution, Paine went on in his letter to George Washington. Little ebbings and flowings for and against the natural companions of revolutions sometimes appear, but the full current of it is, in my opinion, as fixed as the Gulf Stream. The same metaphor of a warming current coming from across the seas is to be found in Paine's dedication of Rights of Man. This is the dedication of Rights of Man. To George Washington, President of the United States of America. Sir, I present you a small treatise in defense of those principles of freedom which your exemplary virtue hath so eminently contributed to establish. The rights of man may become as universal as your benevolence can wish, and that you may enjoy the happiness of seeing the new world regenerate the old, is the prayer of, Sir, your much obliged and obedient humble servant, Thomas Paine. That's more fitting, I suppose. It was the Pitt-supporting Tory George Canning who, in 1826, that he had... Wait. It was the Pitt-supporting Tory George Canning who, in 1826, claimed that he had called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the Old. Winston Churchill, evoking the Atlantic Alliance in a time of peril, told Parliament, this time quoting Arthur Hugh Clough, "But westward look, the land is bright." The metaphysical poets had often compared romantic America to a lover. My America, my newfound land. Pilgrims had sailed to the Americas to establish doctrinal purity, and pirates had made the same voyage in search of treasure and slaves. In Paine's time, however, the New World of the United States of America, a name he may have coined, was an actual and concrete achievement, not an imaginary utopia, but a home for liberty and the conscious first stage of a world revolution. You can only hear me in your left ear. Okay, did that make a difference? I suppose we'll find out. Hmm. I don't know. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what to do about that, man. That sucks if that's true. Didn't do anything, huh? Hmm. Huh. Um, it's got. Oh, wait. I mean, it's balanced. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, man. I don't know what to tell you. Can I set the mic to mono? Okay. I've set it to mono. Um, let me know, I guess. It's now set to mono. Both. Yeah. I'm not sure, man. Yeah, I'm hoping it's something on your end. Because I have no idea what to do on mine. Um, both. Oh yeah, it's only playing on the left side for me too. Come on. That's disappointing. Yeah. I have no idea what to do. On mine. No, there we go. Yeah, oh no. It's only playing on the left side for me too. Come on. That's disappointing. Yeah. Maybe there's something I can do in my settings. No. I'm curious what this will do. I'm going to test that out. I wonder. No. I'm curious what this will do. I'm going to test that out. I don't think it did anything. Oh. I wonder. Oh, it made this sound a little better. It, yeah. I only see one green bar. Yeah. It says, both are both the balance is right on. It's right on the middle. So I'm not sure what it would be. I guess I'll have to figure that out before I go live next time. I'm looking at. I'm changing all the settings here, but oh wait a minute. There we go. But wait, what if I come over here? I see that there's 2 now. What it would be? Would have to listen to the stream. I'll have to figure that out before I go live next time. Looking at. I'm changing all the settings here, but oh wait a minute. There we go. Yeah, no, that's no. What if I come over here? Yeah, that's not right. I see that there's 2 now. Would have to listen to me derp around with these settings, but that's just like a static noise. It's nothing. Okay. Come on. Why are you doing this? Yeah, I know. I'm seeing that static is there, and now I'm worried about it. There we go. That's off again. Well, geez. Okay, sorry you can only hear me in the left ear if you have surround sound, or if you have headphones. Liberty's tree would have been well understood by Mather's fellow artisans and self-taught workers as the symbol of the Enlightenment and of democratic revolution. It recurs as an image in numberless poems, oaths, toasts, and songs of the period, and from the United States Irishman all the way to the letters of Thomas Jefferson, who was not the only one to say that the tree of liberty must be nurtured by the blood of tyrants as well as of patriots. The greeting of the radical Protestant-dominated United Irishman went like this. Are you straight? I am. How straight? As straight as a rush. Go then, in truth, in trust, in unity, and liberty. What have you got in your hand? A green bow. Where did it grow? Where did it first grow? In America. Where did it bud? In France. Where are you going to plant it? In the crown of Great Britain. Robert Burns wrote a poem called The Tree of Liberty, which opens in this vein. Heard ye o' the tree o' France, I wanta what's the name o' it. Around it the patriots dance, wheel Europe keens the fame o' it. It stands where once the Bastille stood, a prison built by kings, man. What superstition's hellish brood kept France in leading strings, man. So both the United Irishman and the Tree of Liberty make references to plants and budding, and the United Irishman is explicitly saying, where did it first grow? In America, that's the American Revolution. Where did it bud? France, that's the French Revolution. And where are you going to plant it? Great Britain. There was actually somewhat of an English Revolution as well. So all of these... Yeah, this is sort of painting a picture of how these thoughts and ideals spread. We can thus be sure that Burns, a great partisan of the 1789 revolution in France, had read Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which at one point described monarchy as a form which infantilized and retarded society as well as increased its tendency towards senility. It appears under all the characters of childhood, decrepitude, dotage, a thing at nurse, in leading strings, or on crutches. And Burns' most famous poem, For That, breathes with a mighty scorn for the conceits of heredity and the hereditary principle, so comprehensively lampooned by Paine. For their part, the United Irishmen... don't do it, Nick. Don't do it. Where are we at? He was one of those rare Englishmen of the period who could write that the suspicion that England governs Ireland for the purpose of keeping her low to prevent her from becoming her rival in trade and manufactures will always operate to hold Ireland in a state of sentimental hostility with England. Does that explain anything about what we've seen recently? To have had a hand in two revolutions, as Paine was later to exult after his first adventures in France, was living to some purpose. That he was too optimistic is certain. Both the revolutions of 1776 and 1789 were to disillusion him in several ways. But his actual influence on revolutionary change can be felt in many more than two countries, including the nation of his birth and its Irish and Scottish and Welsh constituents. The name of Paine will always be insolubly linked to those resonant words, the rights of man. The book which bears that noble title was, however, not just a paean to human liberty. Hey, how's it going, B-Ball? It was partly a short-term polemic directed in particular at Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, a very exceptional contribution to the energetic pamphlet wars that made the late 18th century, with its clubs and pubs and coffee houses and print shops, such an enlivening period in Britain and France and America. It was also partly a revisionist history of England, written from the viewpoint of those who had gained the least from the Norman conquest and the successive monarchical coups and usurpations. Then, again, it was a manifesto, setting out the basic principles of reform and, if necessary, of revolution. It did not disdain to put forward certain practical and immediate pragmatic suggestions designed to alleviate suffering and injustice in the here and now. Watch this. Okay. But it always kept its sights raised to a point somewhere beyond the immediate political and social horizon. It is, in that sense, one of the first modern texts. John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress may have kept alive the spirit of the English Revolution in countless poor and downtrodden homes, and the careful research of John Stuart Mill and others may have laid basis for the later Victorian social reform. But Thomas Paine's Rights of Man is both a trumpet of inspiration and a carefully wrought blueprint for a more rational and decent ordering of society, both domestically and on the international scene. Well, you can't post, Gary. You could DM it to me in Discord. Indeed, it opens as a kind of one-man peace mission devoted to the idea of warmer relations between Britain and France. Paine was a leading member of the British radical tradition that saw wars and armies as additional burdens of the people and as reinforcements of its existing autocracies. What better way for a ruling class to claim and hold power than to pose as the defenders of a nation? And what better way to keep unschooled and unemployed serfs in line than to give them the king's shilling and put them into a uniform under aristocratic commanders? The folk expression, "he's gone to the wars," or "he's been in the wars," expresses by its plurality the vague fatalism about this, and the sense that every now and then it is expected that Johnny will be marched off and perhaps, if God is merciful, will march back again. Southey's After Blenheim catches this perfectly, as does Thackeray's Barry Lyndon. And the fuddled old man in the alehouse in 1984, who blearily says to Winston Smith that it's all wars. Most of Britain's or England's martial and kingly battles had been either with France or in France, and Paine opened his preface to Rights of Man with an account of meeting he had in 1787, 2 years before the fall of the Bastille, with some liberal-minded Frenchmen. One of these, the private secretary to an important minister, he reported finding. This is a letter. This is that letter. That his sentiments and my own perfectly agreed with respect to the madness of war and the wretched impolicy of two nations like England and France continually worrying each other to no other end than that of mutual increase. Of burdens and taxes. That I might be assured I had not misunderstood him, nor he me, I put the substance of our opinions into writing, and sent it to him, subjoining a request that if I should see among the people of England any disposition to cultivate a better understanding between the two nations than had hitherto prevailed, how far I might be authorized to say that the same disposition prevailed on the part of France. He answered me by letter in the most reserved manner, and that not for himself only, but for the minister with whose knowledge the letter was declared to be written. It takes a moment to appreciate the extraordinary impudence that this would have represented in its time. One can hear William Pitt's Tories growling and snarling. Who is this upstart commoner who presumes to conduct his own diplomacy with a Frenchman? I myself cannot think of a precedent for it, but Paine was by then well used to executing unofficial missions of the diplomatic sort on behalf of his newly adopted country, the United States of America. That same thought would have empurpled many Tories even more. Whippersnapper Paine acting on behalf of mutinous colonists to boot. However, it turns out that Paine was behaving more discreetly than many reactionaries might have supposed. He had sent his relevant Anglo-French correspondence to Edmund Burke, a trusty patriot and parliamentarian, whose defense of the American Revolution had won all-around respect. And yet, when the French Rebellion had exploded on the world, Burke had hastened to the printer and had published one of the most sulphurous counter-revolutionary screeds of all time. It is important to understand, therefore, that Rights of Man has its private and emotional dimension. A note of plaintive disappointment from a former admirer that at times can sound almost like the tone of a despised lover. The whole part of Book 1, the whole part the whole of Part 1 of the book, however, is an attempt, as far as possible, to avoid personalizing the question. In his stalwart advocacy of the French Revolution, of the revolution in France, Paine insists that it is Burke who has fallen into an emotional muddle. The persons and characters of King Louis and Marie Antoinette, upon whose behalf Burke expends such a great deal of outrage and misplaced gallantry, are irrelevant, and Burke's prose a silly waste of feeling. The French people rebelled not against these individual monarchs, a mild and lawful monarch, as Burke rather amazingly described the then tenants of Versailles, but against the whole principle of monarchy. They were punishing not just the crimes of this incumbent, but the centuries of crime committed by the dynasty in whose name he ruled. Thus, in a sense, it could be argued that even poor Louis himself was a victim of the hereditary principle. This was not just a mere rhetorical stroke on Paine's part. In Boston and New York and Philadelphia, he well knew portraits of King Louis were displayed in revolutionary homes as an homage to the assistance rendered by France to the American Rebellion. In that struggle, nobody had been more to the fore than the dashing Marquis de Lafayette, whose forces had eventually compelled the surrender of King George's British and German invaders. Lafayette is nowadays somewhat in eclipse, despite the charming park opposite the White House that bears his name. But he actually played a part in 3 revolutions, those of 1776, 1789, and 1848, and was in his time the very talisman and emblem of daring and heroism. Later writers have clumsily compared Paine to Che Guevara as an internationalist, but for Paine himself, the charisma belonged to nobody but Lafayette, whose titles as Marquis he was often reluctant, on Republican grounds, to use in print. However, it obviously suited him to be able to deploy a member of the French nobility against the nostalgic Burke. M. de Lafayette went to America at an early period of the war and continued a volunteer in her service to the end. His conduct through the whole of that enterprise is one of the most extraordinary that is to be found in history of a young man, scarcely then 20 years of age. Situated in a country that was like the lap of sensual pleasure, and with the means to enjoy it, how few are there to be found who would exchange such a scene for the woods and wilderness of America, and pass the flowery years of youth in unprofitable danger and hardship. But such is the fact. When the war ended and he was on the point of taking his final departure, he presented himself to Congress, and contemplating in his affectionate farewell the revolution he had seen, expressed himself in these words: "May this great monument raised to liberty serve as a lesson to the oppressor and as an example to the oppressed." When this address came to the islands of Dr. Franklin, who was then in France, he applied to the court Vergennes. He applied to Count Vergennes to have it inserted in the French Gazette, but never could obtain his consent. The fact that Count Vergennes was an aristocratical despot at home and dreaded the example of the American Revolution in France as certain as other persons dread the example of the French Revolution in England, and Mr. Burke's tribute of fear, for in this light of his book must be considered, runs parallel with Count Vergennes's refusal. The whole project of Rights of Man, then, was in the first instance an attempt to marry the ideas of the American and French revolutions, and in the second instance an attempt to disseminate these ideas in Britain. For Paine, these objectives were essentially three facets of the same symbol. For Burke, they were radically incompatible. One reason for revisiting both books for any student who aspires to any sense of history is to see the same sequence of events debated by two masterly contemporaries. Burke believed that there already had been a revolution in England in 1688, and that it had settled the question for all time. In his view, the Glorious Revolution of that year had instated a stable relationship between monarchy and people, with everyone essentially knowing their place. Any further interference with the monarchy would be profane. It was Paine's task to satirize this end of history view and assert that the right of the people to alter their government was inherent and inalienable. Paine was writing at a moment of hectic optimism when it could be said that immediate questions were mainly relative. Paine was writing at a moment of hectic optimism when it could be said that immediate questions were mainly relative, and thus that the specific merits or vices of the 16th Louis were negligible when one contemplated the historic imperative that the Augean stables of parasites and plunderers were too abominably filthy to be cleansed by anything short of a complete and universal revolution. But he did not simply announce this as if any revolt, however bloody, would be better than none at all. He took particular care to note that 3 days before the fall of the Bastille, Lafayette had asked the National Assembly to adopt a Declaration of Rights. It seemed as if, for the second time in a decade, a country would not just throw off monarchy, but would also inscribe the inalienable rights of the citizen. But the words "as if" are the ones to watch for. For the remainder of the first part of Rights of Man, Paine gave his own moment-by-moment version of the events that had made the overthrow of monarchy inescapable. It is a fascinating and often first-hand account, and most affecting to read because it was composed in a time of optimism. Having dedicated his Part 1 to George Washington, one of the most conservative revolutionaries of all time, and a future target for his most bitter criticism, Paine dedicated Part 2, the less explicitly revolutionary half, to his more radical hero, Lafayette. Wait, that's a double T. Is that Lafayette? Ooh. I'm going to keep saying it, Lafayette. He began with a few extra swipes at Burke, who had at one point undertaken to make a comparison of what he called the British Constitution with the French one. He noted that Burke had not kept this promise, and also that he had further disdained any response to Part 1. This left the field clear for Paine to launch a spirited attack on the hereditary principle, which he ridiculed at length for its self-evident contradictions. To him, the idea of a hereditary ruler was as absurd as the idea of a hereditary mathematician, and put the country at the continual risk of being governed by an imbecile. The madness of King George III lent extra point to these observations. Switching gears, he took up the implied challenge that is extended to all radicals, namely, what do you do? And made a series of detailed proposals for a future system of republican government. Some of these drew upon a comparison between the French system and the British one, and others were concerned with the state of the treasury. Lampooning the finances of the Pitt ministry, Paine compared the combination of a small sinking fund with large borrowings to asking a man with a wooden leg to catch a hare. The longer they run, the farther apart they grow. Finally, he adumbrated a very advanced plan for what we would now call a welfare state. The response of Pitt's government was to try to arrest him for sedition. Paine was never to learn of what Pitt's niece, Lady Hester Stanhope, had reported. Her uncle, she said, used to say that Tom Paine was quite in the right, but then, he would add, what am I to do? As things are, if I were to encourage Paine's opinions, we should have a bloody revolution. This oblique tribute from authority is proof in itself of the tremendous impact that was registered when one self-taught corset maker and bridge designer undertook to instruct his betters in the art of government and based his audacious claim on the foundation of rights, a term which, once heard by its audience, it became impossible to make them forget. Well, that is the introduction to a brief look into history, into how in one particular aspect, humans changed the way they saw themselves and government forever. And it'll be interesting to see what else is in this book for you, I suppose. I've read it already, but it's fantastic, and every time I read it, I notice something else. But eventually I'm going to have to start reading other things that were at one time contemporary, but no longer are, and will give me deeper insight into that time period. But bringing things back to the present, we're not done evolving in our politics. And I suspect we will have more revolutions, and I am wondering exactly what those might look like. I'm a little bit worried, to be honest.